The millionaire went for coffee and started sweating when he saw the maid's ring. "Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications." The sound of the door chimes announced the arrival of a new customer at the Memory Aroma Cafe. The place had a cozy atmosphere, filled with rustic wooden tables and walls decorated with black and white photographs. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sweet aroma of bread fresh from the oven, creating an immediate sense of comfort. Thomas Miller walked in with firm steps, wearing a sharp navy blue suit and a silver watch that caught the warm light of the cafe. His eyes, trained to analyze contracts and figures, scanned the place with precision. He had no intention of staying, just grabbing a coffee to go before heading to an important meeting. But something made him stop. His gaze locked on a young barista behind the counter. She moved with ease, organizing cups with a quick, efficient rhythm. Her hair was tied up in a loose bun, and her face was lit by a genuine smile as she laughed at something a coworker said. Thomas couldn't explain it, but there was something familiar about her. Then, he saw the ring. A sudden chill ran down his spine. His eyes fixated on her hand as she tilted the handle of the coffee maker. The ring on her middle finger was silver, simple but with an unmistakable detail, a small sapphire stone set in the center, surrounded by delicate metal leaves. There was no doubt. He knew that ring. He had bought it himself. Suddenly, the smell of coffee seemed different. The aroma pulled him back into a memory buried deep in his mind. He was sitting on a small balcony years ago, holding a velvet box with trembling hands. In front of him was Olivia, the great love of his youth, looking at him with hopeful eyes and a smile that made the world disappear. "I want this to be a symbol of our future," he had said, placing the ring on her finger. "So that no matter where you go, you'll always remember me." Now, 20 years later, that same ring sparkled on the hand of a young woman he had never met. Thomas shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just a coincidence. Rings like that could exist in many places. It was possible, but not likely. The leaf detail was a custom design, something he had personally requested from a jeweler. He remembered it clearly because it was inspired by something Olivia used to say, "We are leaves carried by the wind, but we always return to our roots." The sound of a spoon tapping against a cup pulled him back to reality. He blinked and realized he had been standing in the middle of the cafe, staring at the barista like a man lost in a dream. Embarrassed, he stepped forward and approached the counter. "Good morning, sir. What can I get you today?" the young woman asked, her smile friendly as she adjusted her cream-colored apron. Thomas opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. He felt a lump in his throat as if he had to swallow down the question he desperately wanted to ask. His eyes flickered to the ring once more, then back to her face. There was an unexpected energy in the air, something he couldn't quite name. "A black coffee. No sugar. To go." She nodded and began preparing his order. He wanted to ask about the ring, about where it came from, who had given it to her, and why it looked so much like the one he had given Olivia. But Thomas Miller was not a man who acted on impulse. He was a strategist. People who act without thinking lose control, and Thomas never lost control. As he waited, he watched the young woman more closely. Her features were soft, but there was something in her expression that tugged at his mind. The more he observed, the more familiar she seemed. The shape of her face, the way she furrowed her brows in concentration, even the slight way she tapped her foot against the ground while waiting for the coffee to brew, it all felt strangely recognizable. The coffee was ready. She placed a lid on the cup and handed it to him with a friendly smile. "Here you go. Have a great day, sir." He took the cup, hesitating for just a moment. There was a question burning in his mind, but he didn't ask it. He simply nodded and walked away. As he reached the door, he glanced back over his shoulder. The young woman had already turned around, chatting with a coworker. The ring on her hand gleamed under the soft lights like a beacon in the fog. On his way to the car, Thomas felt his chest tighten. The image of the ring wouldn't leave his mind. There was something there, a piece of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. He got into his car, took a deep breath, and rested his head on the steering wheel for a moment. This can't be a coincidence, he muttered to himself. He started the engine but didn't drive off right away. For a few minutes, he sat in silence, his thoughts trapped between the present and the past. Memories of Olivia came flooding back. She had vanished from his life without warning. No letters. No calls. No goodbye. Just silence. And now, 20 years later, the same ring he had placed on her finger was shining on the hand of another person. Something was wrong. And he was determined to find out what it was. Later that evening, Thomas sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of the city lights seeping in through the large floor-to-ceiling windows. His penthouse was quiet, too quiet. The silence that had once symbolized peace now felt like a cage. His mind was a storm of thoughts, all circling back to one thing. The ring. He sat on the leather sofa, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together as he stared at the untouched glass of whiskey on the coffee table. His gaze was distant, fixed on something that wasn't there. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, the young woman's hand, the flash of silver, the blue sapphire, the leaf-shaped details. His chest tightened. "It's not a coincidence," he muttered again, his voice low but firm this time. He leaned back on the sofa, his eyes scanning the ceiling as if searching for answers in the shadows. His phone vibrated on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Mark, his business partner. "Everything's ready for the meeting tomorrow at 10. Don't be late." Thomas let out a deep breath, rubbed his face with both hands, and stood up. Business. Deadlines. Deals. These were the things he had mastered for years. He knew how to navigate them with precision. But this was different. This wasn't a deal he could negotiate. It was something much more personal. He glanced at the large bookshelf in the corner of the room. Tucked between rows of financial strategy books and biographies of great leaders was a small wooden box. Slowly, he walked over, pulled the box from the shelf, and sat back down. He opened it with deliberate care. Inside were old photographs. Faded colors, worn edges, but the memories were vivid. His fingers hovered over each photo like they were made of glass. Smiling faces. Sunlit days. He stopped when he reached the one he had been searching for. It was a photo of Olivia. Her eyes looked straight into the camera, filled with that boundless energy she always had. Her hand was resting on her chin, and there it was, the ring on her finger, the exact same one he had seen today. His jaw tightened as he stared at the image, his thumb running lightly over the photo as if he could feel the warmth of that day again. His mind flashed back to the moment she left. No warnings. No letters. Just silence. He had searched for her, but she had vanished. Time had passed, and he convinced himself that it was better that way. But now, it was as if she had never left. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. If Olivia was somehow connected to that girl, if Olivia had a daughter. He shot up from the sofa, pacing around the living room. The air felt heavier with every step. His thoughts moved faster than he could control. "Calm down," he said to himself. "Don't jump to conclusions." But no matter how much he told himself to be rational, the idea had already rooted itself in his mind. There was only one way to find the truth. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered for a second before he tapped the name. Andrew Cole, private investigator. Thomas hadn't spoken to Andrew in years, not since the merger scandal where he needed someone to dig up information on a rival company. Andrew was sharp, discreet, and most importantly, relentless. If there was anyone who could get to the bottom of this, it was him. The phone rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Thomas Miller. To what do I owe the honor? Andrew, I need you to do something for me, Thomas said, his tone steady but sharp. It's personal this time. A short pause. Personal, huh? That's new. You finally found a problem that money can't solve. Thomas didn't laugh. He wasn't in the mood for jokes. Her name is Emily, he said firmly. She works at a cafe called Memory Aroma. I want to know everything about her. Where she's from. Who her parents are. Everything. There was another pause, this time longer. Andrew's tone grew more serious. Understood. I'll start tonight. I'll call you when I have something. Make it quick, Thomas replied and hung up. He sat down again, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. The weight of uncertainty still hung over him, but at least now he had taken the first step. For years, he had lived with unanswered questions about Olivia. Now, it felt like those questions were finally about to be answered. He leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. For a moment, he stayed like that, letting the weight of it all settle. His mind wandered again. Back to the cafe. Back to Emily. Her eyes. Her smile. The way she moved. His heart clenched with a realization he hadn't wanted to face. She reminded him of Olivia. That thought alone was enough to send a fresh wave of doubt through him. He hated doubt. In his world, doubt was a weakness. It paralyzed people. But this time, it wasn't doubt that held him back. It was fear. What if he was right? What if Emily was more than just a stranger? And if she was, what did that mean for him? His eyes shifted back to the photo of Olivia, still lying on the coffee table. He picked it up again, holding it firmly in both hands. His fingers pressed against the edges as if grounding himself in something real. You always ran from me, Olivia, he whispered to the photo. But not this time. The silence of the room felt heavier than before. This wasn't like closing a business deal or winning a negotiation. It wasn't about control, logic, or strategy. It was about something far more fragile. It was about family. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. The next 2 days felt like an eternity. Every time Thomas glanced at his phone, he half expected to see a message from Andrew. But nothing came. Meetings were a blur. Conversations with his business partners passed in a haze of nods and half-hearted responses. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the past and the present. On the third evening, just as he was loosening his tie after a long day at the office, his phone vibrated. The name Andrew Cole lit up the screen. His heart rate quickened. He didn't hesitate. He picked up the call immediately. Tell me you have something, Thomas said, his voice sharper than he intended. I have more than something, Andrew replied, his tone serious. But I'm not sure you're gonna like it. Thomas felt his pulse thudding in his ears. He sat down slowly on the edge of his bed, gripping the phone tighter. Talk, he demanded. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, like Andrew was deciding where to start. The girl, Emily. Full name, Emily Rivera, Andrew began. Lives with her mother in a small apartment on the east side of the city. She's been working at Memory Aroma for about 1.5 years. No criminal record, no red flags. Just a normal 20-year-old girl. Thomas's jaw tightened. Get to the point, Andrew. Another pause. This one longer. Her mother's name is Olivia Rivera, Andrew finally said. Thomas froze. Time itself seemed to pause. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. His grip on the phone became ironclad. Olivia Rivera, he repeated slowly, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. Yes, Andrew confirmed. And before you ask, yes, it's the same Olivia. I pulled old records, old addresses, and even found a photo. It's her, Thomas. She's back in the city. Thomas leaned forward, his head resting in his free hand. His eyes squeezed shut, as if blocking out the world would somehow help him process what he'd just heard. His chest felt like it was caving in. She never left, he muttered, bitterness creeping into his voice. She's been here this whole time. Looks like it, Andrew replied. And there's one more thing you should know. Thomas raised his head slowly, his heart bracing for another blow. What is it? There was no hesitation in Andrew's voice this time. Emily is listed as Olivia's only child, he said. No father listed on her birth certificate. But Thomas, the birth date is 19 years ago. Around the time Olivia disappeared from your life. Silence filled the line. Heavy. Suffocating. The number 19 echoed in Thomas's mind like the toll of a bell. His breathing grew shallow. His eyes darted to the photo of Olivia still sitting on his coffee table. Thomas, you there? Andrew asked. He swallowed hard. I'm here, he said, his voice hollow. Are you sure about the date? Checked it twice, Andrew replied. Her birthday is March 22nd, exactly 9 months after Olivia left you. Do I need to spell it out for you? Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. His entire world felt like it had just been flipped upside down. All the unanswered questions, all the nights he spent wondering where Olivia had gone, and now, he finally had an answer. She hadn't run away. She had hidden. She had hidden their child. He stood up slowly, pacing the room, his breathing coming in short, shallow bursts. Why didn't she tell me, Andrew? Why didn't she say anything, he asked, but it wasn't a question for Andrew. It was for himself. It was for Olivia. It was for the 2 decades of silence that now felt like a betrayal. You want me to keep digging? Andrew asked cautiously. No, Thomas said firmly. No more digging. I have everything I need. All right. You know where to find me if you change your mind, Andrew replied, his tone understanding. Thomas hung up without saying goodbye. He stood there for a moment, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was racing, replaying every moment he'd spent at the cafe, every glance, every smile Emily had given him. She's my daughter. The realization hit him like a wrecking ball. He staggered backward and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands rubbing over his face. His breathing was uneven now, his chest rising and falling like he'd just run a marathon. She's my daughter. She's my daughter. She's my daughter. The words repeated in his mind until they were no longer thoughts but a steady, undeniable truth. That night, sleep was impossible. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every possible scenario. Should he confront Olivia? Should he go back to the cafe and tell Emily everything? Should he do nothing? The image of Emily's smile haunted him. That bright, carefree smile. She had no idea. No idea that the man she had served coffee to was her father. No idea that her life was about to change forever. His heart ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't like losing a deal or seeing a business venture fail. This was different. It was personal. Raw. Unforgiving. By 4 a.m., he was sitting in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in front of him. He hadn't touched it. His eyes were bloodshot, his face unshaven. Every possible scenario played out in his mind. Confront Olivia. Reveal the truth to Emily. Walk away and never say a word. No. He wasn't going to walk away. He wasn't that kind of man. The next day, Thomas stood outside Olivia's apartment building. His hands were in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the entrance like it was the gates of a fortress. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing in the cool air, letting it clear his mind. He was dressed simply, no suit, no watch, no signs of wealth or status. Just a man. A man who needed answers. He entered the building and found her apartment number. For B, the number felt oddly significant, though he didn't know why. He raised his hand, hesitated for a second, then knocked 3 times. Footsteps echoed on the other side of the door. Soft, hesitant steps. The handle turned slowly, and the door opened just enough for her face to peek out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Time itself seemed to pause. Olivia's eyes widened with shock, and she took a step back like she'd seen a ghost. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He clenched his jaw, his eyes never leaving hers. "Hello, Olivia," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She didn't respond. She just stood there, her breath shallow, her eyes darting as if searching for an escape. "No more running," he said, stepping forward, one hand pressed firmly against the door. "No more hiding. I know everything." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. Not the Olivia he remembered, full of fire and independence. This was a woman carrying the weight of secrets far too heavy for one person. "Please, Thomas," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Not here. Not like this." "Then let me in," he said, his tone unwavering. For a moment, she hesitated. But then, with a slow nod, she opened the door fully and stepped aside. As Thomas walked inside, he glanced at the small, cozy apartment. It smelled of lavender and freshly baked bread. His eyes scanned the photos on the wall, stopping on one in particular. It was Emily. Her graduation photo. Cap, gown, and the biggest smile in the world. His eyes lingered on it for a moment too long. He turned to Olivia, his expression sharp but not angry. Just determined. "You're going to tell me everything," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "No lies. No excuses. I want to know why you hid my daughter from me for 19 years. Olivia lowered her head, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Her hands trembled. "I never wanted to hurt you, Thomas," she said quietly. "But I had my reasons." "Then you'd better make me understand," he replied, crossing his arms, his eyes hard as steel. The silence between them was thick, fragile, and ready to break. "All right," she whispered, finally meeting his gaze. "I'll tell you everything." Thomas stood in the center of Olivia's small living room, his arms crossed, his posture stiff with tension. His eyes didn't wander. He wasn't interested in the furniture, the photos on the walls, or the soft scent of lavender floating in the air. His focus was singular. Her. Olivia sat on the edge of the couch, hands fidgeting in her lap, her gaze lowered to the floor like a child caught doing something wrong. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes red from barely contained tears. "Start talking," Thomas said, his voice sharp but controlled. "I've been patient for 19 years. That ends now." Olivia flinched, taking a deep breath as if bracing herself for a painful confession. Her fingers twisted the fabric of her sweater, a nervous tic he remembered all too well. "I never wanted to hurt you, Thomas," she began softly, her voice cracking under the weight of the words. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Back then. I thought I had no other choice." "That's not an answer," he shot back, his tone like steel. "That's an excuse." Her eyes snapped up to meet his, filled with a sudden flare of defiance. "You think it was easy for me? You think I wanted to do this alone? I didn't, Thomas. But I didn't see another way." His jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but intense. "You had a choice. You had a choice to tell me. To let me be part of it. But you didn't. You took that from me, Olivia. You took her from me." Tears slipped from her eyes, but she didn't look away. Her lips trembled, but her voice remained steady. "You were so focused on your career, Thomas," she said, each word cutting deeper than the last. "Your world was boardrooms and meetings and money. I tried to tell you I was pregnant, but every time I opened my mouth, you were too busy answering phone calls or preparing for your next big move." She sniffed, wiping her cheek with the sleeve of her sweater. "I convinced myself you didn't have room for us. For me. For her." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. Thomas felt a weight settle on his chest. His mind flashed back to those days. The long hours, the late nights. He remembered telling her, "This is all for us, Olivia. I'm building something big for us." But now, as he stood in this small, quiet apartment, it was clear that us hadn't been enough. He shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to rewrite history. I would have been there, Olivia. I would have fought for both of you." Her eyes blazed with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "And maybe I would have believed that if you had ever stopped chasing success long enough to prove it." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she covered her face with both hands, breathing hard. Silence filled the room, heavy and unyielding. Thomas took a step back, his gaze dropping to the floor. His mind was racing. Regret, anger, confusion, all swirling in a storm he couldn't control. Had he really been so blind? Had he missed all the signs? But one thought stood above all the others. "You should have told me," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "No matter what you thought, you should have told me." Olivia lowered her hands slowly. Her eyes were glassy with tears, her face pale. "I know," she admitted, her voice trembling with the weight of her guilt. "I know, Thomas. I think about it every day. Every birthday, every first day of school, every night she cried for a father she didn't know she had, I thought about you. I wondered if I had made the right choice." She let out a shaky breath. "But by then, it was too late. Too much time had passed. And I was too afraid to face you." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a second, he had no response. He glanced at the wall, at the photos of Emily at different stages of her life, smiling, laughing, growing up without him. He recognized her smile now. It was Olivia's smile. It was his smile too. He rubbed a hand over his face, letting out a short, bitter laugh. "You robbed me of 19 years with my daughter, Olivia." He turned to face her, his eyes sharp as blades. "How do you make that right?" Her shoulders shook, and for a moment, she was just a woman weighed down by mistakes. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I'm willing to try. If you are." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Slowly, Thomas nodded, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about you and me anymore," he said, his voice firm. "It's about her. And I'm not walking away from her." The next day, Thomas found himself once again standing in front of the Memory Aroma Cafe. His hands were shoved deep in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the window where he could see Emily working behind the counter. She was laughing with a customer, handing him a small paper bag with a bright smile. His heart ached at the sight. "That's my daughter." He stood there for several minutes, unmoving, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had faced mergers, bankruptcies, and lawsuits, but nothing had ever felt as terrifying as this moment. Because this time, he wasn't negotiating a deal. He was about to meet his daughter. His hands clenched in his pockets. His breathing was steady, but his heart was pounding like a drum in his chest. He had spent the whole night thinking about what he would say, how he would say it. He had prepared for every possible reaction. Anger. Shock. Rejection. But nothing could truly prepare him for this. He took a step forward. Then another. His reflection stared back at him from the glass window of the cafe, and for a second, he didn't recognize himself. His eyes looked tired, his face worn with the weight of time and regret. But it didn't matter. He wasn't leaving. He opened the door, and once again, the familiar chime of the bell greeted him. The warm, rich aroma of coffee washed over him. This time, it wasn't comforting. This time, it felt like the air was too thick to breathe. Emily turned to see who had entered. Her eyes met his, and she gave him the same friendly smile she gave every customer. "Welcome back," she said cheerfully. "Black coffee, no sugar, right?" His chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "Black coffee. No sugar." She nodded, turning to prepare his order. Her movements were quick, efficient, and familiar. So familiar. He watched her closely, noticing every small detail. The way she tapped her foot while waiting for the coffee to brew. The way she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Little echoes of Olivia. Little echoes of himself. She placed the cup on the counter and smiled. "Here you go. Have a great day, sir." This time, he didn't walk away. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but quiet. She glanced at him, surprised. "Yes." He swallowed hard, his heart beating so loudly it echoed in his ears. For the first time in years, he was afraid. Truly afraid. But he didn't back down. He couldn't. His eyes locked on hers, unwavering. "My name is Thomas Miller," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't carried in years. I think I might be your father." Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. Emily's smile vanished, her eyes searching his face for some kind of explanation. She blinked, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Her hands went still. Her breathing slowed. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice a whisper of disbelief. He didn't look away. He didn't flinch. "You heard me," he said, his eyes unwavering. "I'm your father." Her face paled, her eyes wide with confusion, disbelief, and something else, something far more fragile. The cup of coffee she'd been holding slipped from her hands. It hit the counter with a soft thud, the liquid spilling slowly across the surface like a growing shadow. She didn't move. Neither did he. They just stared at each other, frozen in a moment that neither of them would ever forget. The cafe fell into a stillness so deep it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. Time didn't slow, it froze. Emily's wide, unblinking eyes locked onto Thomas's. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths, as if her lungs had forgotten how to work. Her fingers hovered just above the counter, still reaching for the spilled cup of coffee she no longer seemed to notice. "What did you just say?" she repeated, her voice quiet but sharp, like the edge of a glass about to crack. Thomas held her gaze. He knew he couldn't back down now. No more running. No more hiding. "I said." He breathed in slowly, steadying himself as if preparing to walk a tightrope. "I'm your father, Emily." Her face twisted, confusion clashing with disbelief. She took a step back, her hands pressing flat against the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her on her feet. "No," she muttered, shaking her head slowly. "No, no, no. You're lying." "I'm not," Thomas replied firmly, his voice calm but unwavering. "I wish I were, but I'm not." Her eyes darted around the cafe, looking for an escape. Her gaze flickered to the other employees, but no one was paying attention. Customers sat at their tables, chatting, scrolling on their phones, oblivious to the emotional earthquake taking place just feet away from them. She took another step back, her breathing quickening. Her eyes filled with something Thomas recognized all too well, panic. "No," she repeated, more forcefully this time. "This doesn't make any sense. This isn't real. You can't just walk in here and say that." Her voice was rising. The customers glanced up, a few brows furrowed with curiosity. The barista next to her, a young man wearing headphones, pulled one earbud out and gave her a concerned look. "Everything okay, Em?" he asked, his gaze flicking between her and Thomas. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice cracking. She turned her back on Thomas, wiping her hands on her apron in quick, jerky motions. Her breathing was still uneven. Thomas felt his throat tighten, but he didn't let himself look away. "This is your chance, don't waste it." "Emily," he said softly, but with enough weight that she froze mid-motion. "I know this is a lot. I know it's confusing, and I know you don't believe me. But I can explain. Please, just give me a chance to explain." She stayed facing away from him, her shoulders rising and falling with quick breaths. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Explain?" she said, her voice brittle and sharp. She let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears that refused to fall. Her gaze pierced through him, raw and sharp like broken glass. "Explain how you suddenly decide to show up now. 19 years, and now you decide you're my father." She shook her head again, her lips curling into a mixture of disbelief and pain. "Where were you all this time? Huh? Where were you when I needed you?" Her words hit him like a blow to the chest. His heart ached, but he didn't flinch. He didn't run. "I didn't know," he said simply, his voice low and honest. "If I had known, I would have been there. I swear to you, Emily, I would have been there. Don't." Her voice was sharp as a blade. Her eyes filled with a quiet rage that burned hotter than shouting ever could. "Don't stand there and act like you care. You don't get to act like you care now." The barista with the headphones was watching them more intently now, his eyes darting between Emily and Thomas. Thomas felt the weight of being watched, but it didn't matter. "Not right now." "Emily," Thomas said, taking a step forward, hands out in front of him as if to show he meant no harm. "I know this is unfair. I know it's too much to drop on you like this. But I had to tell you. I couldn't keep it from you any longer." His voice cracked just slightly, but he held it together. "I'm not here to force you to accept me. I'm here because you deserve the truth. You deserve to know where you come from." Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a hard line. "Where I come from," she said coldly. "I know where I come from. I come from my mom. My mom raised me. She didn't need you then, and I don't need you now." Her words were like daggers, and this time, Thomas felt them sink in. Deep. Deeper than he expected. He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the counter for a moment, but he quickly raised them back to hers. "You're right," he said quietly, his tone stripped of pride or ego. "Your mom did it all on her own, and I'll never take that away from her. She's stronger than I ever gave her credit for." His voice softened, gentler now. "But that doesn't change the fact that I'm here. I'm here now, Emily. And I'm not going anywhere." She stared at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears, her lips pressed so tightly together they quivered. For a moment, she looked like she might say something. But instead, she grabbed a rag and began wiping the spilled coffee on the counter with sharp, angry movements. "Your coffee's cold," she muttered, her voice shaking. "Forget the coffee," Thomas said, stepping forward. "Look at me, Emily." Her hands froze. Slowly, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with so much hurt, confusion, and exhaustion that it physically hurt him to see it. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I'm not asking for anything. But I'm your father, whether you like it or not. And I'm going to be here." Her breath hitched. She blinked quickly, her gaze flicking to the side like she was searching for something, somewhere to run, somewhere to hide. Her eyes landed on the doorway to the kitchen, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might bolt. But she didn't. Instead, she set down the rag with slow, deliberate movements. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes stayed locked on the counter, refusing to meet his. "Get out," she whispered. Thomas didn't move. He didn't breathe. "Get out," she said louder this time, her voice cracking in the middle of the word. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter again, her knuckles white as bone. Her whole body was shaking. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Just, get out." He hesitated. Every part of him told him to stay. Stay and fight. Stay and make her see you. Stay and don't give up. But his heart knew better. "Okay," he said softly, his voice low but steady. He stepped back slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'll go. But I'm not disappearing, Emily. I'll be back." Her breath hitched again, and she turned away, wiping her face quickly with her sleeve. She didn't look at him. She didn't say another word. Thomas turned toward the door, his steps slow and heavy. Every footstep echoed louder than it should have, each one a reminder of how far apart they still were. He reached the door, pulled it open, and stepped outside. The cold air hit him hard, but it wasn't nearly as sharp as the pain in his chest. He stood there for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. His breath came out in slow, foggy puffs. For the first time in years, he felt small. He felt powerless. But he wasn't going to walk away. Not again. Not this time. He glanced back at the cafe through the window. Emily was leaning over the counter, her face buried in her hands. His heart twisted in his chest. He'd broken something today. But broken things could be rebuilt. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with cold, sharp air. "I'm not giving up on you, Emily," he whispered to himself. "Not now. Not ever." With that, he turned and walked away. Rain drizzled softly against the glass walls of Thomas's office. The skyline of the city stretched out before him, distant lights blinking like stars trapped on the ground. But for once, Thomas wasn't looking at it. His back was to the view, his eyes locked on the screen of his phone, fingers hovering above the screen like he wasn't sure what to do. The cursor blinked on an unsent message. "Emily, I'm sorry. I know I should have." He deleted it. His jaw tightened as he leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face. What was he even supposed to say? Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry didn't fix 19 years of absence. There was a knock on the door. Sharp. Precise. 3 taps. "Come in," he called, not bothering to turn around. The door creaked open, and the familiar voice of his assistant, Rachel, echoed behind him. "Mr. Miller, the report from the Alvarez merger is ready. Should I leave it on your desk?" "Yeah," he muttered, his eyes still fixed on the blank message. Rachel hesitated. He could hear it in the pause of her footsteps. Normally, she'd drop the file and leave, but today, her presence lingered. "Sir," she said carefully, "are you all right?" Thomas lowered the phone, tilting his head back against the leather headrest of his chair. For a moment, he just stared at the ceiling, letting the weight of the question settle. Was he all right? No. Not even close. "I'm fine, Rachel," he finally replied, his tone colder than he intended. She didn't press him, just placed the file on his desk and left quietly. The door clicked shut, and silence filled the room once more. He sat there, gripping the phone like it was a lifeline. His mind wandered back to the moment in the cafe, the look on Emily's face, the hurt in her voice, the way her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the counter. He hadn't seen that kind of pain in someone's eyes since Olivia. The thought hit him like a freight train. He stood abruptly, shoving the phone into his pocket. His chest felt tight, his breathing short. I did that to her. I did that to both of them. No. No more running. He wasn't going to be that man anymore. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of his office. Rachel raised her head from her desk as he passed. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the day," he said without looking back. "But, Mr. Miller, you have a..." "Cancel them, Rachel," he repeated, his tone firm, final. "Yes, sir," she replied, already typing on her keyboard. Later that night, Thomas found himself once again outside Olivia's apartment building. Rain poured harder now, soaking his coat and dripping from his hair, but he didn't care. His eyes stayed locked on the intercom by the front door. He hadn't called. He hadn't sent a message. He just showed up. His finger hovered over the buzzer for apartment 4B. He pressed it. 1 ring. 2. 3. He heard the static crackle of the intercom, then her voice, distant but clear. "Who is it?" she asked, sounding tired. "It's me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Thomas." Silence. Then a soft sigh, followed by the buzz of the door unlocking. He pushed it open and climbed the stairs, water dripping from his coat, his footsteps heavy on the metal steps. The hallway was dimly lit, the pale yellow glow from the overhead lights flickering every few seconds. When he reached the door to 4B, it was already open. Olivia stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her eyes guarded but not surprised. She leaned against the frame, looking him up and down. "You're soaked," she said, her voice neutral. "You'll ruin my floors." "I'll pay for them," he replied, stepping inside. Her lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. More like a flicker of disbelief. She closed the door behind him, locking it quietly. Her apartment smelled like bread and chamomile tea. He could hear the faint sound of a television playing a sitcom in the background. "She's not here," Olivia said before he could ask. His brow furrowed. "Where is she?" "Out with friends. Probably won't be back until late," she said, walking toward the small kitchen. She grabbed a towel and tossed it at him. "You should dry off before you catch a cold." "Not that I care, but you look ridiculous standing there like a drowned dog." Thomas caught the towel, rubbing it over his face and hair. He glanced at the kitchen table, small, round, with 3 mismatched chairs around it. 2 mugs sat there, one half full of tea. For a brief second, he imagined Olivia and Emily sitting there together, talking, laughing. A life he wasn't part of. "You told her, didn't you?" Olivia's voice pulled him back. She leaned against the counter, arms still crossed, eyes watching him carefully. "At the cafe." "You told her?" "Yes," he admitted, tossing the damp towel onto the back of a chair. Her eyes closed briefly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You weren't supposed to do it like that." "How was I supposed to do it, Olivia?" His voice rose, not in anger, but in frustration. "Wait another 19 years. Send her a card that says, 'Hey, by the way, I'm your father.'" "You could have told me first," she shot back, her eyes blazing now. "We could have done it together. But no, you had to make it about you. Just like you always do." Her words struck hard, but this time, he didn't react. He let them land. He let them hurt. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly, looking down at his hands. "Maybe I was selfish. But I'm tired, Olivia. I'm tired of being a man who waits for permission to do what's right." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "She deserves to know me. I deserve to know her." Olivia's eyes softened, but her guard didn't lower. She looked away, her fingers tapping against her arm. "She's not ready, Thomas," she said, her voice quieter now. "She's angry. And hurt. You saw that, didn't you?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice tight. "I saw it." "Then you know this isn't going to be easy," she said, stepping closer. Her eyes met his, steady and clear. She's not going to just forgive you because you showed up with big words and good intentions. I know. Her gaze lingered on him, searching for something. When she found it, she sighed. She's like you know, she muttered, almost smiling. Stubborn as hell. A dry laugh escaped him. Guess she gets that from both of us. Silence fell between them again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. It was something else. Not forgiveness, but understanding. You'll have to be patient, Olivia said, leaning against the table. She'll push you away. She's good at that. She can push all she wants, he replied, his eyes unwavering. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time, Olivia's eyes softened into something warmer. Sadder. She nodded slowly, as if she finally believed him. Good, she said quietly. Because she needs you, Thomas. Even if she doesn't know it yet. Her words hit him harder than anything else that day. He sat down at the small table, the chair creaking under his weight. His fingers tapped against the wooden surface, eyes distant but thoughtful. When she comes home, he said slowly, let me stay. Just for a little while. Olivia raised an eyebrow. So you can sit in silence while she ignores you? Yeah, he said with a small, tired smile. I'll take whatever she's willing to give. For the first time, Olivia smiled too. It wasn't big. It wasn't bright. But it was real. You always were stubborn, she muttered, shaking her head. Must be where she gets it from, he replied, leaning back in the chair, eyes still on the door. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas didn't feel like running. The soft hum of the television filled the room, its flickering light casting shifting shadows on the walls. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his fingers tapping slowly against the wood, an uneven rhythm that mirrored his restless thoughts. The rain outside had picked up, tapping against the windows like tiny fingers begging to be let in. He glanced at the door every few seconds, eyes sharp, waiting. Every distant footstep in the hallway outside made him tense, but each time, the steps faded away. Olivia stood by the sink, washing out the mugs in slow, thoughtful circles. She hadn't said much since their earlier conversation, but she didn't have to. The weight of the moment spoke louder than either of them could. Thomas rubbed his hands together, his gaze locked on the door like it might swing open at any second. You know she's going to be angry when she sees you here, Olivia said, not turning around. Her voice was calm, but there was a warning in it. I know, he replied, his eyes still fixed on the door. She's got every right to be. Olivia dried her hands on a dish towel, glancing over her shoulder at him. It's not just anger, Thomas. It's confusion. Hurt. You can't fix that with a speech or a promise. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together. I'm not here to fix it, Olivia. I'm here to show her I'm not leaving. Her eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded. The ticking of the kitchen clock grew louder. Each second dragged longer than the last. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. This time, they didn't fade away. Thomas straightened in his chair, his heart suddenly pounding harder than it should. Here we go. The sound of keys jingling came next. Metal on metal. The distinct click of the front door unlocking. His breath caught in his chest. The door opened slowly, and Emily stepped in, her hoodie soaked from the rain, her hair damp and clinging to her cheeks. She shoved her hood back, shaking the water from her hair like a stray cat that had been caught in a storm. Her headphones hung around her neck, faint music still playing from them. Her eyes scanned the room, casual at first, until she saw him. She stopped. Her entire body went rigid, her eyes narrowing into sharp, defensive slits. What is he doing here? She said, her voice cold as steel. Emily, Olivia began carefully, like someone trying to soothe a wild animal. He's just here to. No, Emily cut her off, taking a step forward. Her gaze stayed locked on Thomas, her eyes full of fire and something far more dangerous, betrayal. Why is he here, Mom? Why is he in our house? Thomas slowly stood from his chair, raising his hands like a man walking through a minefield. His movements were slow, deliberate. I just want to talk, Emily. That's it. I'm not here to cause trouble. Her eyes darted between him and Olivia. You brought him here, she asked, her tone filled with disbelief. Her voice cracked on the last word. No, Olivia said firmly, stepping closer. He came on his own. And you let him in. Emily's voice rose, higher now, edged with panic. Her breathing quickened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Why would you do that, Mom? Why would you? Because you need to hear him out, Olivia interrupted, her voice steady but strong. Because if you don't, you'll regret it later. Emily let out a short, bitter laugh, wiping her face with her sleeve. No, I won't. I'm fine. I've been fine without him for 19 years, and I'll be fine for 19 more. That one hurt. Thomas felt it hit deep, but he didn't show it. He stood his ground, his eyes never leaving hers. Emily, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You can hate me. You can yell. You can tell me to leave 1,000 times, and I'll understand. But I'm not going anywhere. Her eyes blazed with fury. You don't get to do this. You don't get to walk in here like you're some kind of hero. I don't need you to show up for me now. Her voice broke on the last word, her breathing ragged as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. I know you don't, he said softly, his eyes filled with a weight of his own. You've already proven you don't need me. But needing me and wanting me are two different things. Her jaw tightened, her eyes darting away from him. He had struck a nerve. I know I'm late, Emily, he continued, his voice never rising, never breaking. I know I missed everything. Birthdays. School plays. Every scraped knee. Every heartbreak. I wasn't there. He took a small step closer, careful not to push too far. But I'm here now. And I'm not leaving. You think that matters? She hissed, turning to face him again. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away furiously. You think you can just show up and say, I'm here now, like that fixes everything? Newsflash, it doesn't. Her voice cracked with raw emotion, and her body shook as she breathed. You don't get to be here now, she whispered, her voice hoarse, broken. You don't get to walk in after 19 years and just be my dad. Her words shattered the air like glass hitting the ground. Her breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling with every shallow breath. Her pain was raw, exposed, and sharp as broken glass. For a moment, silence filled the room. Thomas's heart felt like it had been ripped from his chest, but he didn't run from it. He stepped forward one more time, slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm not asking you to call me Dad, Emily, he said softly, his voice like a steady anchor in a storm. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not even asking you to let me in. He took another slow step forward, hands still in front of him, open, empty. I'm just asking you to give me a chance. Her breathing slowed. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You had your chance, she muttered. You had 19 years of chances. He nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. You're right. I did. His voice was rough but steady. And I wasted them. I'll live with that for the rest of my life. Her lips quivered. Her eyes darted to Olivia, then back to him. Her voice came out quieter this time. Smaller. What do you even want from me? She asked, her arms crossed tight over her chest. What do you want, Thomas? His name hit him harder than any insult. Thomas. Not Dad. Not Father. Just Thomas. I just want a chance to know you, he said, his voice steady but raw with honesty. No strings. No pressure. I just want to know who you are, Emily. Her lips pressed together tightly, and for a moment, she didn't move. Her breathing slowed, her fingers still gripping her sleeves like they were the only things keeping her together. That's all I want, he repeated, his voice soft but unshakable. One chance. You tell me when. You tell me how. But I'll wait. Her eyes flickered, her gaze darting to Olivia again. Her mother nodded once, slow and steady. Emily's eyes returned to him, her face unreadable. Her lips parted like she was going to say something, but she hesitated. Her eyes lowered to the floor. She sniffed, wiping her nose with her sleeve. I'm not making any promises, she muttered. Her voice was quieter now, but it was still there. Stronger than she realized. If you mess up, I'm done. Thomas felt his chest loosen, his breath finally coming in smoothly. A weight he hadn't realized he was carrying slowly lifted. Deal, he said, his voice firm but worn. Emily didn't look at him. She didn't look at Olivia. She just pulled her hoodie tighter around herself and walked to her room. The door clicked shut behind her. Thomas let out a long, shaky breath, his eyes fixed on the closed door. That went better than I expected, Olivia muttered from behind him, sipping her tea. He let out a quiet laugh, his eyes still on the door. Yeah, he said softly. Better than I expected too. Morning light seeped through the thin curtains of Olivia's apartment, painting the walls in soft shades of orange and gold. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the air. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than silence. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. His eyes were distant, focused on nothing in particular, his thoughts running circles in his mind. Every few seconds, his gaze flickered toward the hallway where Emily's room was, the door still closed. She's not a morning person, Olivia said from the kitchen counter, where she was slicing bread. She glanced at him over her shoulder, her eyes sharp but not unkind. You'll be waiting a while if you think she's coming out before 10. Thomas smirked faintly, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm not in a rush. Good, Olivia replied, placing 2 slices of bread into the toaster. Because patience is the only thing that's going to get you through this. Thomas leaned back in his chair, tilting his head toward the ceiling with a deep exhale. I've handled billion-dollar negotiations, Olivia. I can handle a stubborn teenager. Her sharp laugh filled the air, dry but honest. She glanced at him with a knowing look. Oh, you poor fool, she muttered, shaking her head. His smirk grew into a quiet chuckle, but it faded quickly. His eyes went back to the hallway door. She hadn't said a word to him since last night. Not at dinner. Not before bed. Not even a glance. It was like he didn't exist. And maybe that's what scared him the most. An hour later, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. The bedroom door creaked open, and Emily appeared, still wearing her hoodie from the night before. Her eyes were half closed, her hair a tangled mess, and she moved like a ghost barely tethered to reality. Thomas straightened in his chair as soon as he saw her, but he forced himself to stay calm, keep his movements slow. Don't overwhelm her. Don't push. Morning, he said, his voice careful, quiet. Emily didn't look at him. She walked straight to the kitchen, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a bowl. Her movements were mechanical, like she was operating on autopilot. She grabbed a box of cereal, poured it into the bowl, then filled it with milk. She sat at the table. Right across from him. She didn't look up. Thomas watched her for a moment, unsure of what to do with the sudden closeness. Don't force it. Just be here. He cleared his throat. I heard you like photography, he said, his voice casual, like he was talking about the weather. Her spoon paused for half a second, but she didn't look at him. She took a slow bite, her eyes fixed on the cereal as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Your mom mentioned it, Thomas added, trying again. She said you've got a good eye for it. No response. Silence hung between them like a taut string. Olivia glanced at them from the kitchen sink, wiping a plate with a towel, her eyes darting back and forth like she was watching a tennis match. She didn't intervene. She just watched. Thomas tapped his fingers on the edge of his coffee mug, trying to think of what to say next. No lectures. No speeches. Just be real. You know, I never understood photography, he admitted, leaning forward slightly. I always thought it was just pictures of things you could see with your own eyes. Never got why people found it so special. Emily's spoon paused midair. Slowly, her eyes lifted to meet his. He saw it. Just for a second. That spark of curiosity. But, he continued, his gaze steady, someone once told me that photography isn't about capturing what you see. It's about capturing what you feel when you see it. He glanced at her then, his voice quieter, more thoughtful. I think I finally get it now. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than before, her brows pinched together like she wasn't sure if he was being sincere or just talking to hear himself speak. Slowly, she lowered her gaze, taking another bite of cereal without a word. But she didn't shut him out completely. Not this time. That was enough for him. Later that day, Thomas found himself pacing in front of a small photo shop in the city. The large window display was filled with digital cameras, old film cameras, and photo albums. Inside, rows of equipment lined the shelves, tripods, lenses, and rolls of film stacked neatly in glass cases. He'd never been in a place like this before. It felt foreign. Intimate, even. A man behind the counter, probably in his early 20s, looked up from his phone. Need help, man? He asked, his eyes flicking up and down, sizing Thomas up like he didn't belong. Yeah, Thomas said, walking in slowly, hands in his coat pockets. I'm looking for a camera. Well, you came to the right place, the guy said, setting his phone aside. What kind are you looking for? DSLR? Mirrorless? You want something for travel or professional shots? Thomas frowned, eyes narrowing slightly. I have no idea what any of that means. Something good, he said vaguely. For someone who's serious about it. Not a toy. Something real. The man nodded knowingly, walking toward one of the displays. All right, I got you. Follow me. The guy pulled a camera from one of the shelves. It was sleek, black, and heavier than it looked. This one's solid. Good for beginners, but it's got all the features a pro would need too. Thomas picked it up, turning it in his hands, feeling the weight of it. It felt important. Like holding something delicate but powerful. He glanced at the price tag. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't about the price. He paid in cash. No hesitation. That evening, Thomas sat in his car outside Olivia's apartment again. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, reflecting the glow of streetlights like pools of melted gold. He glanced at the box in the passenger seat. The camera was still inside, packed neatly, untouched. He stared at it for a long time. Longer than he expected. Would she even accept it? Would she see it as a bribe? Would she even care? He rubbed his hands together, his fingers tingling with nerves he wasn't used to feeling. Don't overthink it. Just do it. He grabbed the box, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the building. His steps were slower this time, like every footstep had to be measured. When he reached the door, he buzzed 4B. Olivia's voice came through the speaker. What now, Thomas? Just open the door, Olivia, he said with a tired sigh. A pause. Then the soft buzz of the lock. When she opened the apartment door, she raised an eyebrow at him. Her eyes flickered to the box in his hands. "You better not have bought her something expensive," Olivia muttered, tilting her head toward the living room. "Not expensive," he said, stepping inside. "Just something real." Emily was on the couch, phone in hand, her earbuds in. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing like she was ready to fight. Thomas held up the box, his movements slow, deliberate. "This isn't a bribe," he said, setting it on the coffee table. "It's not an apology either." Her eyes darted from him to the box, suspicious but curious. "It's just a gift," he said, stepping back. "You don't have to like it. You don't even have to keep it. But I figured someone with a good eye deserves a good camera." Emily's eyes flickered. Just for a second. But it was there. "Do what you want with it," he said, glancing at Olivia. "I'll see myself out." He walked toward the door, his steps slow, waiting for a reaction. "Thomas," Emily's voice called out, stopping him mid-step. He glanced back. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were on the box. "Thanks," she muttered, barely above a whisper. He smiled softly. "Anytime, kid." Then he left. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a stranger anymore. The soft click of the camera shutter echoed through the apartment, sharp but satisfying. Emily lowered the camera from her face, her fingers hovering over the buttons as she inspected the screen. Her brows furrowed, her lips pressed into a tight line. Too dark. She adjusted the settings, turning the small dial with slow, careful precision. Another click. This time, the image was better. The light from the kitchen window hit the table just right, creating long shadows that stretched across the wood grain. Her eyes lingered on the image, studying it like she was searching for a flaw only she could see. "Looks good to me," Olivia said from the couch, one leg curled under her as she scrolled on her phone. Her voice was casual, but there was pride in it. "That camera suits you, kid." Emily glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's just a practice shot." "Practice or not, it's good," Olivia replied, without looking up from her phone. "You've always had the eye for it. Now you've got the right tool." Emily didn't respond. She glanced back at the camera, tilting it in her hands. It still felt strange to hold something so expensive. Heavy, but in a good way. Like it meant something. Her eyes flicked to the small logo on the top of the camera. She knew exactly where it had come from. Him. Her fingers tightened around the grip, her thumb brushing over the buttons. Part of her wanted to hate it, to hate him for giving it to her. Gifts were easy. They didn't cost him anything. He thinks this will make up for everything. But she couldn't lie to herself. She loved the camera. Her gaze shifted to the front door, as if expecting him to walk in at any moment. But of course, he didn't. He never stayed long. Always in, always out. With a huff, she stood and grabbed her hoodie from the back of a chair. "Where are you going?" Olivia asked, looking up from her phone. "Out," Emily replied, pulling the hoodie over her head and tucking the camera's strap securely around her neck. "Out where?" Olivia pressed, leaning forward now, her eyes narrowing. "Just out, Mom." "I'm not a kid," Emily muttered, opening the door. "Be back before dark," Olivia called after her. "And don't drop that camera. I'm not paying to replace it." Emily didn't respond. She stepped outside, shutting the door behind her with a quiet click. The city felt different through a camera lens. Every building, every crack in the sidewalk, every reflection in a puddle suddenly had meaning. Emily wandered through the streets, snapping shots at random, a crooked stop sign, an old man feeding pigeons, the silhouette of a dog running through the rain-soaked alley. She crouched low for some shots, climbed up on the edge of a stone planter for others. Her breath fogged in the cold air, but she didn't feel it. She was too focused. Too present. It wasn't like using her phone camera. This was real. Every shot mattered. Every mistake was hers to own, and every success felt earned. She spotted a couple on the other side of the street, two teenagers sitting on a bus stop bench, huddled under a single umbrella, their faces close as they laughed at something only they could hear. Emily lifted the camera, adjusted the focus, and click. The sound of the shutter felt different this time. Like capturing something alive. She checked the image. It was perfect. The rain blurred in the background like a soft curtain, the couple's smiles frozen in time, raw and real. Her chest felt warm, like something had clicked inside her too. This is what he meant, she realized. It's not about what you see. It's about what you feel. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, staring at the couple's joy. Her mind wandered back to him. To Thomas. No. Stop. Her heart hardened, the warmth gone in an instant. She shoved the camera strap higher on her shoulder and kept walking. 2 days passed before she saw him again. She had just gotten home from school, her bag slung over one shoulder, still damp from a sudden downpour that had caught her off guard. She pulled off her hoodie and tossed it on the couch, her hair a tangled mess. Olivia was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with loud, steady thuds. "You're soaked," Olivia said, not even looking up. "Grab a towel before you catch a cold." Emily grunted in response, heading toward the bathroom to do just that. As she dried her face, she heard voices from the living room. Not just Olivia's. Him. Her stomach twisted. She walked back slowly, gripping the towel like it was a shield. There he was, standing in the middle of their tiny living room like he didn't know what to do with himself. No suit today. Just jeans, a gray sweater, and a leather jacket. It made him look normal. Less like a businessman, more like a person. "Hey," he said, his eyes meeting hers the second she entered. He'd been waiting for her. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone flat, sharp as a knife. "I wanted to see you," he said simply. "Check in." "Check in." She raised an eyebrow, dropping the towel onto the arm of the couch. "I'm not a project, Thomas." His eyes flickered with something, hurt, maybe, but he didn't react. "I know you're not," he said softly, taking a small step forward. "But I'm here anyway." Emily crossed her arms, her gaze locked on him like she was waiting for him to slip up. "How's the camera?" he asked, glancing at the strap around her neck. Her eyes darted down to the camera, then back up at him. "It's fine," she muttered. "Fine?" he echoed, a small grin tugging at his lips. "Just fine." "Yeah, fine," she said, her voice sharp, defensive. "Don't act like it means anything." His grin faded, replaced by something more serious. "It means something if you want it to," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Doesn't have to mean more than that." Silence. Heavy. Awkward. Unforgiving. Olivia glanced up from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Her eyes flickered between them, her face unreadable. "Emily," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Don't you have those photos you were going to upload today?" Emily turned toward her mother, confused at first. Then she caught the look in Olivia's eyes. A silent nudge. "Go. Do something. Get out of your head." "Yeah," Emily muttered, turning on her heel. She walked into her room, but she didn't close the door all the way. Her back leaned against it, just out of sight, her eyes still locked on the narrow gap. She could hear them talking. "You need to be patient with her," Olivia's voice said softly, words muffled but clear enough. "I am," Thomas replied. "I will be. Don't push too hard. She's not like you, Thomas. She's fragile." "She's not fragile, Olivia," he said firmly, his voice carrying more weight now. She's stronger than both of us combined. She just doesn't know it yet. Emily felt a lump in her throat she hadn't expected. She turned away from the door, her eyes stinging, and sat on the edge of her bed. Her fingers hovered over the camera around her neck. She lifted it slowly, eyes distant but thoughtful. She turned it toward herself, staring at the reflection in the lens. Her own face stared back, sharp but soft at the same time. For the first time, she really looked at herself. Her fingers moved instinctively. Focus. Framing. Light. Her eyes flicked to the door, her heart thudding in her chest. Her finger hovered over the button. Click. The image appeared on the screen. Her face. Her eyes. Her uncertainty. Her strength. She didn't delete it. Instead, she stared at it for a long, long time. The apartment was quieter than usual. No TV. No music. Just the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint tap-tap of Emily's fingers on her laptop keyboard. She sat at the kitchen table, her camera resting beside her, its strap tangled with the edge of her hoodie sleeve. Her eyes were locked on the screen as she edited photos with sharp precision, adjusting brightness, cropping, and pulling out details most people wouldn't even notice. Across from her, Thomas sat with his own kind of focus. A notebook lay open in front of him, a pen in his hand tapping lightly against the page. Every so often, he glanced at her, but she didn't look back. Not once. He didn't press her. He didn't say a word. Sometimes silence was necessary. He scribbled something on the notepad, crossed it out, and wrote it again. The pen scratched against the paper in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Every now and then, he glanced up like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Don't force it. Just be here. Minutes passed like this, the kind of quiet where every little sound becomes louder. The sound of her mouse clicking. The creak of Thomas shifting in his chair. The soft huff of Olivia flipping a page in her book from the couch. Then, Emily sighed. Not loud, but loud enough. She sat back in her chair, pulling her hands through her hair in frustration. Her eyes stayed on the screen like it had just betrayed her. What's wrong? Thomas asked without thinking. She froze for half a second, her eyes darting to him before narrowing into sharp slits. Nothing, she muttered, clicking the mouse with more force than necessary. Stupid, Thomas. Too soon. Looks like something, he said, keeping his tone light. Her jaw tightened, her fingers still gripping the edge of the laptop. She looked at him, her eyes flat, unimpressed. You wouldn't get it, she said coldly. Try me, he replied, his voice calm but firm. She raised an eyebrow at him like she was about to brush him off, but something shifted in her expression. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was exhaustion. Whatever it was, she turned the laptop toward him. Fine, she said, tilting the screen so he could see. Look at this. On the screen was a photo of a woman walking under an umbrella on a rainy street. Her reflection shimmered perfectly in a puddle below her, a mirror image split by ripples from a falling raindrop. Thomas tilted his head, taking it in. Looks pretty good to me, he said honestly. Emily scoffed, leaning forward and pointing to the reflection. Look at this part, she said, jabbing her finger at the screen. The raindrop hit too soon. It blurred the reflection. The timing's off. He blinked, squinting at the spot she was pointing at. It was subtle. Barely noticeable unless you were really looking for it. Most people wouldn't even see that, he said, glancing at her. Yeah, well, I see it, she muttered, folding her arms. You can't control the rain, Emily, he said, his voice softer now. Sometimes things aren't perfect, even when you do everything right. Her eyes darted to him, sharp and wary. Her lips pressed into a line, like she didn't want to agree with him but knew he had a point. You're not wrong, she said quietly, turning the laptop back toward herself. He raised his eyebrows in surprise, leaning back in his chair. Was that agreement I just heard? She rolled her eyes so hard it was a miracle they didn't get stuck. Don't get used to it. But he caught the smallest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth before she buried her face in the laptop again. The next afternoon, Emily stood at the edge of a skate park, her camera held up to her eye. Kids zipped past her on skateboards, some of them launching off ramps with wild, reckless energy. She tracked them with her lens, following their movements with careful patience. Click. A boy in midair, arms spread wide, his shadow stretched long against the concrete. She smiled a little, already knowing it was a good shot. Cool shot, a voice said from behind her. She jumped, twisting around with her heart in her throat. It was him. Thomas. He stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at her with a small smile. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone more defensive than she'd intended. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you," he said, his smile softening. "I was just passing by. Saw you and figured I'd say hi." Her eyes narrowed. "You were just passing by a skate park on the other side of the city?" He hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "Okay, fine. I asked your mom where you'd be." Her eyes narrowed further, lips pursed like she was holding something back. "Stalker much?" "Concerned father," he corrected, his grin small but present. "Big difference." "Debatable," she muttered, lifting the camera again to focus on a skater grinding down a metal rail. "Can I see some of your shots?" he asked, nodding toward her camera. Her fingers hovered over the camera buttons. Her first instinct was to say no, but something made her pause. Her eyes flicked to him, then back to the camera. "Why do you care?" she wanted to ask. But instead, she sighed and handed it to him. "Don't drop it," she warned. "Wasn't planning to," he said, taking it carefully like it was made of glass. He scrolled through the photos, his face thoughtful, eyes scanning each image with a level of attention she didn't expect. He didn't rush. He didn't give shallow compliments. He just looked. "This one's great," he said, turning the camera to show her a shot of a skater mid-flip, his board spinning perfectly beneath him. "The timing here is insane. How'd you catch that?" Emily glanced at it, her eyes flicking back to his face. "Patience," she said simply. His lips twitched into a smile, his eyes flickering with something that looked like pride. He handed the camera back, his fingers brushing against hers for half a second. "Patience, huh?" he repeated, his voice quieter now. "You're better at that than I ever was." Her eyes flickered to his, narrowing just a bit. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or something else. Was he talking about her? Or himself? "Yeah, well, maybe it skips a generation," she said, turning away, lifting the camera back to her eye. He chuckled, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Maybe it does." For a while, they stood there in silence. The distant sound of skateboard wheels scraping concrete filled the air. No forced conversation. No awkward questions. Just presence. "Can I come with you next time?" he asked suddenly, his voice careful but sincere. "Not to bother you. Just to see what you see." Emily lowered the camera, staring at him like he'd just spoken in another language. "You want to follow me around while I take photos?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," he replied, his eyes steady. "If you'll let me." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt, confusion, and something else. Curiosity. "Maybe," she said finally, looking away. Her voice was quiet but not dismissive. Thomas smiled, his eyes bright with something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. "Maybe's good enough for me," he said softly, watching her lift the camera again. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The smell of rain lingered in the air, fresh but heavy. Water dripped steadily from the edge of the apartment balcony, each drop landing on the metal railing with a soft, hollow plink. Thomas stood outside, leaning against the cold metal, his phone pressed to his ear. His jaw was tight, his brows pulled together in concentration. "I understand, Mark," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I told you, I'm not flying out this week." The voice on the other end was muffled but sharp with frustration. "We can't afford for you to be unavailable, Thomas," Mark's voice shot back. "The investors need to see you." "Not me. You." Thomas sighed, tilting his head back to stare at the gray sky. Drops of rain kissed his face. "Then tell them I'll be there next week. I've got something more important to handle right now." There was silence on the other end. Long tense. "More important than a multi-million-dollar merger?" Mark asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "Yeah," Thomas replied without hesitation. "A lot more important." Mark let out a dry laugh. "You've changed, Miller. The old you would have been on the first flight out." "Yeah, well," Thomas muttered, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the window to the apartment, where he could see Emily sitting at the kitchen table, camera in hand, editing photos with quiet focus. "The old me missed a lot of things that mattered." There was another pause. Softer this time. "All right, Thomas," Mark said, his voice calmer now. "Take care of it." "I will," he said before hanging up. For a moment, he stayed there, staring at the street below. People passed by under umbrellas, their faces hidden behind raincoats and hoods. The world kept moving, unaware of the storm inside him. He tapped the phone against his palm, letting out a slow breath. "This time, I'm staying." Later that evening, the apartment was quieter than usual. Olivia sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine with half-hearted interest. Emily was at the kitchen table, headphones on, completely absorbed in her world of photos and edits. Thomas stood by the counter, watching them both. It had been weeks since he started showing up, little by little, day by day. At first, he was afraid they'd tell him to leave. But now, it was as if he'd become part of the rhythm of the house. Not fully included, but no longer a stranger. "Emily," he called softly. She didn't respond. Her music was too loud. "Emily," he repeated, louder this time. She finally pulled one side of her headphones down, glancing at him with that familiar "what do you want now?" expression. "What?" "Come with me," he said, grabbing his coat from the back of a chair. "I want to show you something." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Show me what?" "You'll see," he replied, slipping on his coat. He glanced at Olivia, who raised an eyebrow at him but didn't say anything. She just flipped a page in her magazine, eyes sharp but uninterested. "Hard pass," Emily said, putting her headphones back on. But Thomas didn't move. He leaned on the back of her chair, tilting his head just enough so she could see him from the corner of her eye. "Come on," he said, his voice low, calm, but not pleading. "Just this once." Emily hesitated. Her eyes flicked to him, then to Olivia, looking for some kind of signal. But Olivia didn't look up from her magazine. She simply said, "If you don't go, he's just gonna keep staring at you like that." Emily sighed so hard it sounded like she'd been asked to carry a boulder up a mountain. She pulled off her headphones, tossed them onto the table, and stood. "This better be worth it," she muttered, grabbing her jacket. "It will be," Thomas said with a small smile. The drive was quiet. Neither of them spoke. The rain tapped softly against the roof of the car as the windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm. Emily stared out the window, her cheek pressed against her fist, watching the streetlights blur past. Thomas glanced at her once but didn't say anything. He knew better. Sometimes silence did more than words ever could. When he pulled up to their destination, Emily frowned, her eyes narrowing with confusion. "You brought me to a warehouse," she asked, leaning forward to look through the windshield. Not just a warehouse, Thomas said, unbuckling his seatbelt. Come on. She didn't move. Her eyes flickered with suspicion again. This isn't some father-daughter bonding thing, is it? 'Cause I'm not about to do trust falls with you. Thomas barked out a short laugh, shaking his head. No trust falls. I promise. She rolled her eyes but followed him out of the car. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, misting the air with a cold chill. Thomas walked ahead, leading her toward a side entrance. When they stepped inside, Emily stopped short. The space was wide and open, filled with large framed photographs hanging from wires and metal displays. The room smelled faintly of paint and metal, and the air buzzed with a soft hum of electricity. People moved slowly through the space, hands in their pockets, heads tilted as they gazed at the photos hanging on the walls. An art gallery. Her eyes darted around, taking in every detail. The low light. The quiet buzz of conversation. The soft, ambient music playing from unseen speakers. She spotted a woman with a name tag near the entrance, handing out pamphlets about the exhibit. Her gaze flicked to Thomas, eyebrows raised in suspicion. Why are we here? He nodded toward the far end of the room, his eyes fixed on something. Go look, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Her brows knitted together, but she followed his gaze, slowly making her way to the wall. Her footsteps were light, slow, her eyes scanning each photo as she passed. Shots of city life. People walking through crowds. Strangers caught in unguarded moments. And then she saw it. Her breath caught in her chest. Her photo. The one she'd taken at the skate park. The boy mid-flip, his board spinning beneath him, the shadow stretching behind him like wings. The photo was framed, mounted, and hanging on the wall with a small placard beneath it. Her name was on it. Emily Rivera. Her heart started beating faster. She glanced back at Thomas, eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. How did you? I know the gallery curator, he said, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. I showed her your photo. She said it was good. You had no right, she snapped, turning to face him, eyes filled with anger. That wasn't yours to show, Thomas. I know, he said, his voice calm, steady. But it wasn't about me. It was about you. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She turned back to look at the photo, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. Her eyes darted over every inch of it, the framing, the shadow, the timing. It wasn't perfect. She could see all the mistakes she'd made. But somehow, seeing it on the wall, framed, lit, and displayed for strangers to see, it felt different. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. She didn't know if she was angry, embarrassed, or something else entirely. You can be mad at me, Thomas said, stepping beside her. That's fine. I deserve it. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the photo. But I just wanted you to see it the way I see it, he continued, his voice quieter now. It's not just a photo, Emily. It's you. It's your patience. Your timing. Your eye. People deserve to see that. Her throat felt tight. She swallowed hard, eyes stinging. Don't say stuff like that, she muttered, wiping her cheek with her sleeve. Why not? He asked softly, glancing at her. She didn't answer. She just kept staring at the photo. Her name. Her work. Her moment. For the first time, she didn't hate it. The ride home was silent, but it wasn't the heavy kind of silence. It wasn't the suffocating quiet filled with anger, doubt, or words that had no place to go. This silence was different. Softer. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the cold window, eyes watching the world pass by in blurry streaks of streetlights and rain. The reflection of the city danced across the glass, but her mind was somewhere else. Her fingers drummed absently on her thigh, her breath steady but slow. Thomas glanced at her every so often. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They'd said enough at the gallery. Her photo. Her name. Her work on display for strangers to see. He could still see the way her face had changed when she saw it, the confusion, the spark of anger, and then, something else. Something deeper. Pride, maybe. Acceptance. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his thoughts were back at that moment. He'd seen it in her eyes. She finally saw herself the way he saw her. When they pulled up outside the apartment, the rain had slowed to a mist, the streetlights glowing softly in the fog. Neither of them moved for a moment. The engine hummed quietly, a faint buzz filling the air. Emily let out a long breath and finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't cold. It was just, tired. "I know," Thomas replied, his eyes still on the steering wheel. "You went behind my back," she added, her gaze still fixed on the window. Her breath fogged up the glass, and she wiped it away with her sleeve. "Yeah," he admitted. "No excuses. No justifications. I did." Silence settled in again, longer this time. She rubbed her hands together, her eyes darting around like she was searching for something to say but couldn't quite find it. "I didn't hate it," she muttered, barely louder than a whisper. Thomas's head turned toward her, his eyes steady on her face. "What?" "I didn't hate it," she repeated, her eyes still on the window, her voice firmer now. Her fingers tugged at the sleeves of her hoodie. "Seeing it up there. My name. My photo. It didn't feel as bad as I thought it would." He didn't respond right away. He just let her words linger in the air. "Good," he said quietly, nodding once. "Because you deserve to be seen, Emily. Whether you believe it or not." Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she just sat there, her fingers still fidgeting with her sleeves. "You keep saying stuff like that," she muttered, her eyes finally turning toward him, her face unreadable. "Like you think you know me." He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the steering wheel. His eyes stayed locked on hers, steady but soft. "I'm trying to," he said honestly. Her eyes darted away from his like she couldn't handle the weight of it. She grabbed the door handle, ready to leave, but paused. Her fingers hovered over the handle for just a second too long. "Next time," she said slowly, her eyes still on the door, "don't do it without asking me." Thomas blinked, his chest tightening. "Next time." "Deal," he said softly, watching her push the door open and step into the misty rain. She didn't look back, but she didn't slam the door either. She just closed it gently, her hood pulled up over her head. He watched her walk to the building entrance, one hand in her pocket, the other holding the strap of her camera bag. Before she went inside, she glanced back. Just for a second. Just enough for him to see her face. It wasn't a smile, but it wasn't a scowl either. Then she disappeared inside. Thomas leaned back in his seat, his head resting against the headrest. He closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath through his nose. One step at a time. The next few days passed quietly, but something had shifted. Emily didn't avoid him as much. She didn't run to her room the second he arrived at the apartment. Sometimes, she stayed at the table while he sat nearby. Sometimes, she even asked him to move over if he was blocking her view of the window. Small things. Little shifts in the atmosphere. On Wednesday, Thomas walked into the apartment after work, his coat still wet from the rain. Olivia glanced up from the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand, stirring something that smelled like garlic and onions. "She's in her room," Olivia said without him even asking. "How is she?" he asked, hanging his coat on the back of a chair. "Quiet," Olivia replied, tasting the sauce with a small sip. But not the lock the door and don't talk to me kind of quiet. Just thinking, I guess. Thomas nodded, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. Quiet was good. Quiet meant something was happening. She showed me some new photos, Olivia added, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. He raised his eyebrows. She did? Yeah, Olivia said, tapping the spoon on the edge of the pot. Didn't say much, but she showed them to me. Didn't ask for my opinion, though. Just showed them. Thomas's heart swelled in a way he wasn't prepared for. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice casual. That's a good sign. Don't get too excited, Miller, Olivia said, but her tone was lighter than usual. She's still figuring it out. Yeah, he said, smiling to himself. Aren't we all? That night, Thomas stayed later than usual. He sat on the couch, flipping through the news on TV, his eyes barely focused on the screen. Olivia had already gone to bed, and the apartment was dim except for the glow of the television. He glanced down the hallway toward Emily's room. Her door was closed, but light peeked through the bottom. Should I say goodnight? Should I knock? Would that be too much? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of a door opening. Emily stepped into the hallway, rubbing her eyes like she'd just woken up. Her hoodie was draped loosely over her hair a tangled mess of curls and frizz. She squinted at him like she didn't expect to see him still there. You're still here? She asked, her voice thick with sleep. Yeah, he said, turning the volume down on the TV. Didn't feel like leaving yet. She stared at him for a moment, eyes darting from him to the door, like she was calculating something in her head. Then, slowly, she walked over to the couch. She didn't sit next to him. She sat on the far end, as far away as she could while still being on the same couch. She pulled her knees up, hugging them to her chest, her face half hidden by her sleeve. Neither of them said anything. On TV, some news anchor was talking about stock market trends, but neither of them cared. The silence wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was normal. After a few minutes, Thomas glanced at her. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady and slow. She'd fallen asleep. For a moment, he didn't move. He just watched her, his eyes soft with something that felt far too big to put into words. He reached for the folded blanket on the edge of the couch, pulling it over her carefully, slowly, so she wouldn't wake up. Her head tilted slightly, but she didn't stir. He sat back, his heart full, his mind quiet. This is enough. For now, this is enough. He leaned his head back, letting his eyes close, the sounds of the TV drifting into white noise. For the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel like a man on the outside looking in. He felt like he belonged. The warm glow of the morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting golden stripes across the living room. The television was still on, muted, with headlines scrolling along the bottom of the screen. Thomas blinked awake slowly, his neck stiff from the awkward angle he'd slept in. He squinted against the sunlight, letting out a low groan as he straightened up on the couch. His back ached, his muscles protesting after a night spent in such an uncomfortable position. Not as young as I used to be, he thought, rubbing the back of his neck. It took him a second to realize he wasn't alone. Emily was still on the other end of the couch, curled into a ball under the blanket he'd draped over her the night before. Her breathing was soft and even, her face half buried in the fabric of her hoodie. Her headphones hung loosely around her neck, and her phone was still clutched in one hand. For a moment, Thomas just watched her, careful not to move too much. She looked so small like that, he thought, his chest tightening in a way he wasn't used to. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:43 a.m. Olivia would probably be up soon. He debated waking Emily, but something stopped him. Let her sleep. He moved slowly, standing up from the couch with practiced care, like he was sneaking out of a room full of glass. His eyes stayed on her the whole time, making sure she didn't wake. When he reached the kitchen, he took a breath, letting the tension roll off his shoulders. The smell of coffee filled the air minutes later, the quiet hiss and drip of the coffee maker breaking the early morning silence. He poured himself a cup, leaning against the counter, eyes still flicking back to the living room every few seconds. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He picked it up and glanced at the screen. Mark, business partner. Investors want to reschedule. Can you meet Friday at noon? Thomas stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen. He glanced back at the couch, where Emily still slept soundly. He typed his response. Thomas. No. Next week. I already told you. The reply came almost instantly. Mark. You're really serious about this, huh? Thomas didn't reply. He just put the phone face down on the counter and took another sip of his coffee. An hour later, the sound of the shower running echoed from down the hall. Olivia was awake. The kitchen smelled of scrambled eggs and butter, and Thomas was at the stove, using a spatula to flip the eggs in the pan. Did I miss something? Olivia's voice came from behind him, still thick with sleep. She was wearing an old gray sweatshirt and sweatpants, her damp hair wrapped in a towel. Her eyes scanned the room, narrowing as she spotted Emily still curled up on the couch. She stayed out here last night, Thomas said, keeping his eyes on the pan. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching into the beginning of a smirk. That's a first. Yeah, I noticed, he said, scooping the eggs onto a plate. Didn't want to wake her. Olivia crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway, watching him carefully. You know you're not as subtle as you think you are, right? Thomas glanced at her over his shoulder, one brow raised. What's that supposed to mean? Means you're trying too hard, she replied, tilting her head toward Emily. You're walking on eggshells like she's gonna break if you breathe too loud. He shook his head, setting the plate down on the counter. I'm not trying too hard. I'm being careful. Careful and distant aren't the same thing, Thomas, Olivia said, her tone sharper now, like she was calling him out on something she'd been waiting to say. If you want her to trust you, you've got to stop acting like she's a guest in her own house. Her words lingered, sharp and uncomfortably true. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a slow breath. She's barely letting me be here, Olivia, he muttered. I pushed too hard, and she'll shut me out. Olivia stepped closer, lowering her voice. She's already shut you out, Thomas. The only way in is to stop waiting for her to open the door. You knock. Every single day. He glanced at her, his jaw tight. Knock every day. I'm here, aren't I? He said, but it came out more defensive than he meant it to. Yeah, Olivia said, leaning in a little closer, her eyes locked on his. But be here. Not just physically. Be here where it counts. Her words hung in the air like smoke, seeping into every corner of his mind. Be here. He glanced at the living room again, where Emily had started to stir. She pulled the blanket over her head, her face still hidden. Not a kid, but not an adult either. Stuck in between. Thomas nodded to himself, like he'd just made a decision. He pulled out a second plate from the cabinet and started adding more eggs to the pan. An hour later, Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hair wild with sleep, her face blank with the kind of exhaustion only teenagers could master. Her plate of scrambled eggs sat in front of her, untouched. She tapped at her phone with one hand, scrolling aimlessly, while her other hand propped up her head. You planning to eat that, or are you waiting for it to hatch? Thomas asked, nodding toward the plate. She shot him a dry look, her fingers still scrolling on her phone. I'm serious, he added, taking a bite of his own eggs. Can't be out there taking photos if you're too weak to lift the camera. Emily rolled her eyes. Classic dad move. But she picked up the fork and took a small bite, chewing slowly like she was proving a point. Happy now? She muttered. Ecstatic, Thomas said, grinning around his coffee cup. Silence settled over them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. Emily took another bite, her eyes still locked on her phone, but she wasn't scrolling anymore. Just staring. After a moment, she glanced up at him. "Hey," she said suddenly, her voice more serious now. "Yeah." She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the side like she wasn't sure if she wanted to say it. Her lips pressed together, but after a second, she spoke. "You remember that shot of the kid at the skate park?" she asked, tapping her fingers against the table. Thomas nodded. "The flip shot. Hard to forget." Her eyes stayed on the table, her fingers tapping out an uneven rhythm. "I think I want to take more like that," she muttered. "Like, capture more movement. Not just still stuff." "That's a good idea," he said carefully, leaning forward. "Those kinds of shots aren't easy. You'll have to be fast." "Yeah, I know," she said quickly, like she'd already thought of that. "But I figure if I practice enough, I can get it right." He nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. She's planning something. She's thinking ahead. She's moving forward. "You will," he said firmly, his eyes steady on hers. "You're already good. You just don't know it yet." Her eyes met his for a second, just a second, before she glanced away, hiding her face behind her hair. She shoved another forkful of eggs into her mouth, chewing with a little too much focus. Thomas didn't push it. One step at a time. When Olivia walked into the kitchen, still drying her hair with a towel, she glanced between the two of them. She raised an eyebrow. "Something happen?" she asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Nope," Emily said, shoving another bite of eggs into her mouth. "Nothing at all," Thomas added, his grin just a little too wide. Olivia tilted her head, squinting at them both like she didn't believe a word they were saying. But after a second, she shrugged. "All right. But if you two start plotting, I want in." Emily snorted a laugh, covering it with her hand like she didn't want them to know she'd found that funny. Thomas didn't say anything. But as he watched her laugh, small, quiet, but real, he felt it again. Hope. Rain tapped gently against the windowpane, blurring the view of the world outside. The soft, rhythmic sound filled the apartment like a quiet melody, steady and constant. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her camera resting on the table in front of her, lens cap off, pointed at nothing in particular. Her fingers traced the edge of the lens, slow, thoughtful movements, like she was lost in her own world. Her laptop was open next to her, several images displayed on the screen. Shots from the skate park, street scenes, strangers on rainy sidewalks. Her work. Her world, captured in still frames. Thomas sat across from her, a cup of coffee cradled in his hands. He didn't say anything. He just watched her. Not in a way that felt intrusive, but like someone admiring something they didn't fully understand. "You're quiet today," he said softly, taking a sip of his coffee. Emily's eyes flickered toward him briefly before returning to her camera. "Thinking. About what?" She tilted her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a shrug, she said, "Stuff." "Ah," he said, nodding like that answer made perfect sense. "Stuff." Her eyes narrowed at him. "Don't do that." "Do what?" he asked, his eyebrows raised in mock innocence. "That thing where you act like you're all wise and patient," she muttered, flipping her camera around in her hands. "Like you're some kind of sage or something." He chuckled quietly, setting his cup down. "I'm not wise, kid. Trust me." "You sure act like it," she shot back, but there wasn't as much bite in her words as usual. A comfortable quiet fell between them. Emily turned her attention back to her camera, pressing a few buttons, scrolling through her photo gallery. Her eyes scanned each shot like she was grading them, searching for flaws. You ever feel like you're not good at something, even when people tell you that you are? She asked suddenly, her voice quieter than before. She didn't look up. Thomas's eyes sharpened, his fingers tapping slowly against his coffee cup. Yeah, he said after a moment. Happens more than I'd like to admit. She glanced at him this time, eyebrows raised. You. Mr. I run multi-million-dollar companies, feels like that? All the time, he replied, leaning forward, his gaze steady on hers. Doesn't matter how much money you have or how many people say you're the best. Sometimes you're your own worst critic. Emily's lips pressed together like she was holding back a response. She glanced at the photos on her screen, fingers hovering over the delete button. You thinking of getting rid of those? He asked, tilting his head toward the laptop. They're not good, she muttered, her finger hovering just above the button. Not good or not perfect? He asked, his voice gentle but firm. Her eyes darted toward him, sharp, but thoughtful. She didn't answer. You know, Thomas continued, leaning back in his chair, when I first started in business, I used to obsess over every deal. Every little detail had to be perfect, or I'd think I failed. Kept me up at night, had me redoing contracts that didn't even need fixing. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. I wasted so much time chasing perfection that I missed the things that were already good enough. Emily stayed quiet, her eyes locked on the screen. Perfection's a lie, Em, he said, his tone more serious now. You'll never catch it. And if you keep trying, you'll just end up deleting the best parts of what you've already done. Her finger moved away from the delete button. She stared at the photo a little longer. The boy mid-flip. The motion. The rawness. She didn't delete it. Her eyes flickered toward him, her gaze softer this time. That's supposed to be one of those fatherly wisdom moments, she asked, tilting her head. Only if it worked, he shot back, grinning. This time, she didn't roll her eyes. She just looked back at the screen. That afternoon, Thomas found himself back at the skate park. It wasn't part of his plan. He was supposed to have a conference call, but instead, he stood by the edge of the ramps, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. He spotted her instantly. Emily was crouched low, her camera pressed to her face, tracking the movement of a skater grinding down a metal rail. Her movements were fluid, her focus intense. She leaned to the side as she followed the skater's motion, her finger lightly tapping the shutter button. Click. 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 Her eyes stayed sharp on her subject, her focus unshakable. When the skater landed, she lowered the camera, checked the shots, and let out a small breath, like she was measuring her own success. Thomas watched her with quiet pride. Look at her. She's a force. He didn't call out to her. He didn't announce his presence. He just leaned against a nearby lamp post, watching her work. A boy on a skateboard rolled up beside him, popping the board up into his hand with a smooth motion. He glanced at Thomas, raising an eyebrow. That your kid? The boy asked, nodding toward Emily. Thomas glanced at him, then back at Emily. My kid. Yeah, he said, the word feeling heavier and more real than he expected. That's my kid. The boy grinned, tucking his board under his arm. She's got a good eye. She's always out here taking pictures. People started calling her Shutter, 'cause she's always clicking that camera. Shutter, huh? Thomas's lips curled into a smile. I like that. Yeah, she's cool, the boy said before skating off, his board wheels thudding softly against the concrete. Thomas stayed where he was, watching her crouch down again, angling for another shot. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, giving everything a faint shimmer. Everything looked more alive after the rain. After a few minutes, Emily finally spotted him. Her eyes narrowed, her shoulders straightening. She lowered the camera, walking over with slow, deliberate steps. "You following me now?" she asked, her tone flat but not angry. "Just passing by," he said with a smirk. "Saw a girl with a camera. Figured I'd see if she was any good." She raised an eyebrow, tilting her head. And, he said, looking directly at her, "she's not bad." Her lips twitched into something close to a smile. "Not quite there, but close enough." "You want to help or just stand there looking proud of yourself?" she asked, stepping past him, her camera raised again. His heart swelled with something he didn't expect. "She's letting me in. Guess I could carry your gear," he said, his grin widening. "Yeah, you do that," she replied, but there was no bite in her voice this time. "Don't drop it, though. This stuff's expensive." "Don't worry," he said, stepping forward to follow her. "I've got it." He didn't mean just the gear. He meant all of it. Her. Them. This. He wasn't letting it fall. Not this time. That night, Emily sat on the floor of her room, her back against her bed, laptop on her knees. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard as she stared at the post button on her photo-sharing page. Her eyes flicked to the photo she'd chosen. The boy mid-flip. The moment frozen perfectly in motion. Her finger hovered. Hesitated. Then, she clicked it. Photo posted. She stared at it for a second, her heart beating just a little faster than it should. From the other room, she heard the clinking of plates, her mom and Thomas talking quietly in the kitchen. Their voices weren't loud, but they were there. Present. Real. Her eyes flickered to the photo one last time. Not perfect. But good. A small, quiet smile tugged at her lips. The soft glow of Emily's laptop screen lit up her face in the dim light of her room. It was late. Her curtains were drawn, but the faint glow of a street lamp outside slipped through the edges, casting a thin line of orange across the wall. She sat cross-legged on her bed, her camera in her lap and her phone in one hand, scrolling slowly. Notifications flickered on the screen. 3 new comments. 12 likes. 2 saves. Her photo, the boy mid-flip, was getting attention. Not viral-level attention, but people had noticed. Comments rolled in. "This shot is insane. Perfect timing. The motion on this is wild. Respect. How did you even get this angle? Fire, fire, fire." Emily stared at the screen longer than she needed to. Her fingers hovered over the keys, unsure of how to respond. Her heart was doing that thing, that quick, uneven rhythm it always did when something mattered. She typed. "Thanks." Simple. Direct. No overthinking. Her fingers hovered for a second longer before she hit send. Her eyes moved back to the photo, her gaze softer now. Not perfect, but good. She could hear Thomas's words echo in her head, steady and calm. "Perfection's a lie, kid. You'll never catch it." A small, quiet breath escaped her nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sigh. She glanced at her door. It was cracked open just a little, enough to hear the distant sounds of conversation from the kitchen. She didn't realize it until now, but it had been a while since her mom's voice didn't sound so tired. And Thomas's voice, deep, steady, annoyingly persistent, had started to feel like part of the house. Not loud. Not overwhelming. Just there. She looked back at the screen, clicked on another one of her photos, and started editing. Her fingers moved a little faster this time. In the kitchen, Thomas was drying dishes, stacking them neatly on the rack by the sink. Olivia stood beside him, arms crossed, leaning against the counter. Her eyes were on him, her expression unreadable, but it wasn't tense. Just observant. "You've been here a lot lately," she said, grabbing a towel and tossing it on the counter next to him. "Yeah," he replied, setting down a plate with care. "That a problem?" "Not yet," she said, but there was a teasing edge to her voice. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before she shook her head, a quiet smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "You're different." He glanced at her, eyebrows raised. "Different how?" "Calmer," she said, tilting her head as if seeing him from a new angle. "You used to walk around like you had something to prove to everyone. Like you were chasing something you couldn't catch." She shrugged. "Now, you just exist. It's weird." Thomas let out a short laugh, wiping his hands on the towel. "You make it sound like I'm some kind of Zen monk now." "You're not," Olivia replied quickly, pointing at him. "Don't get cocky. But you're not the man you were 19 years ago. That's for sure." He leaned against the counter, his eyes distant but thoughtful. That guy didn't know what he was missing. Olivia didn't reply. She didn't need to. They stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle in like an old friend. The rain had stopped outside, but every so often, a drop of water would fall from the roof and tap softly against the window. "You think she's letting me in?" Thomas asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. Olivia tilted her head, considering it. "She hasn't thrown you out yet," she said, her voice lighter. "That's progress." He snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'll take that." "Don't screw it up," Olivia added, looking at him with that sharp, familiar gaze that always felt like she could see straight through him. "She's not a kid you can win over with gifts or charm, Thomas. She's stubborn. She's cautious. And she's been disappointed before." "I know," he said, his voice more serious now. "That's why I'm staying." Olivia studied him for a long moment. Her eyes searched his face, looking for cracks, looking for weakness. When she didn't find any, she nodded once, slow and certain. "Good," she said, her voice softer this time. Later that night, the apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes when everyone else is asleep. Thomas sat on the couch, his phone in hand, scrolling through old photos he hadn't looked at in years. Pictures of old business trips, awards, and blurry photos from nights out with colleagues who barely mattered now. None of it felt important anymore. He swiped past a photo of himself in a suit, standing in front of a crowd at a conference. His smile was wide, his eyes sharp, but when he looked closer, he saw it. Hollow. He closed the app and locked his phone, letting it fall onto the couch beside him. His head tipped back against the cushion, his eyes closed. Then, a soft sound. A door creaking. His eyes opened slowly. Footsteps, light but deliberate, padded down the hallway. He sat up, blinking the sleep from his eyes. Emily appeared, rubbing her face, hair wild from sleep. She looked half awake, her eyes squinted against the dim glow from the kitchen. "Hey," he said softly, his voice rough from exhaustion. "Hey," she mumbled, walking past him toward the fridge. She opened it, stared inside like she'd forgotten what she was looking for, then grabbed a bottle of water. She twisted the cap off and took a long sip. She glanced at him over the top of the bottle, eyes half-lidded with sleep. "You're still here?" she asked, wiping her mouth with her sleeve. "Yeah," he replied, leaning forward, his arms resting on his knees. "Guess I am." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes shifted toward the window, watching the glow of streetlights outside. Her fingers tapped lightly against the bottle. "Mom says you're not running this time," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. Her eyes didn't move from the window. "I'm not," he said simply. Silence. She looked at him now, really looked at him. Her eyes lingered, scanning his face like she was looking for cracks, for signs of weakness. She stared for so long, he thought she might say something sharp, something to push him away. But instead, she nodded. Just once. She put the cap back on the bottle and started walking back toward the hall. She stopped halfway, turning just slightly to glance at him over her shoulder. "Night, Thomas," she said, her voice soft but clear. He blinked, surprised. She's never said that before. Not once. He smiled, small but real. "Good night, Emily." She disappeared down the hall, her footsteps fading into the quiet. Thomas sat back on the couch, his heart feeling too big for his chest. His eyes lingered on the hallway for a moment longer before he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He closed his eyes, his breath steady, his thoughts quieter than they'd been in years. She said goodnight. For the first time, it didn't feel like he was standing outside their world, waiting for the door to open. It felt like he was already inside. A year later, the world felt different. Not because it had changed, but because they had. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long streaks of orange, pink, and gold across the sky. The soft hum of the city buzzed in the background, car horns, distant music, and the faint chatter of people on the street. But inside the new restaurant, Roots Renewal, all that noise faded into something quieter, something warmer. The smell of garlic, fresh herbs, and baked bread filled the air, wrapping everyone in a cocoon of comfort. The wooden tables were polished to a soft glow, fresh plants hung from the ceiling in small clay pots, and the air hummed with quiet energy. At one of the tables, Emily sat with her camera in hand, tilting it up slightly to get the perfect shot. Her eyes narrowed in focus as she framed the plate in front of her, freshly made ravioli, topped with basil and parmesan, the steam still rising in gentle swirls. Click. She lowered the camera and checked the screen. Her lips twitched into a small, satisfied smile. "Perfect. You better send me that shot," Olivia called from across the restaurant, her apron tied around her waist, hands on her hips as she watched the kitchen crew move like a well-rehearsed orchestra. "That one's going on the website." Emily raised an eyebrow. "That'll cost you." "Put it on my tab," Olivia shot back, turning to check on the pasta being plated at the counter. Thomas stood nearby, sleeves rolled up, his watch gone for the first time in years. His hands rested on his hips as he watched Olivia taste the sauce, her eyes narrowing like she was solving a mystery. He glanced at Emily, who was now scrolling through her camera, reviewing her shots. "Look at them. My family." It had been months of work, endless nights of planning, tasting, arguing, and pushing each other to the edge. But somehow, they'd done it. They'd built something real. The restaurant was more than just a business. It was a symbol. A reflection of everything they'd fought through together. Roots. Renewal. Emily stood from her chair, slinging the camera strap around her neck. She made her way to the counter, leaning on it next to Thomas. She tapped the display screen of her camera, showing him one of the shots she'd taken of the restaurant's entrance. The wooden sign above the door, with the words "Roots Renewal" carved in bold, simple letters, was framed perfectly against the evening light. "That one's my favorite," she said, her voice quieter than usual, but clear. Thomas leaned in, studying the image like it was the most important thing in the world. His eyes softened, his lips tugging into a smile. "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "That's the one." She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, then turned to face him fully. "You're not just saying that, right?" He raised a hand in surrender. "Nope. Honest opinion. That's the shot." For a second, she just stared at him, her eyes sharp like she was still trying to figure him out. But this time, she didn't challenge him. She nodded, brushing a loose curl out of her face. "Yeah," she muttered, looking back at the camera. "I think so too." Her voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't hard. It was just, sure. Confidence. Thomas didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. She'd found it on her own. That night, after the last table had been served, the lights in the restaurant dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over the space. Most of the staff had already gone home, and the air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and fresh herbs. Olivia sat at the kitchen counter, untying her apron and tossing it onto a chair. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands sticking out in every direction. She looked tired, but her smile was brighter than it had been in years. Thomas poured 3 small glasses of red wine, placing them on the counter in front of her. "To surviving the first week," he said, raising his glass. "To not losing our minds," Olivia added, raising hers. Emily rolled her eyes but grabbed her glass anyway. "To not burning the place down," she muttered with a grin. They all clinked their glasses together, a soft, clear ding that echoed in the stillness of the restaurant. They each took a sip, letting out sighs of relief. "You know," Olivia said, leaning on the counter with a tired smile, "I didn't think we'd make it this far." "Same," Emily admitted, swirling the wine in her glass. Her eyes shifted toward Thomas, a quiet look of acknowledgement. "But I guess we did." Thomas raised his glass again, his gaze steady on both of them. "His family." "We did," he said softly, and for the first time, there was no doubt in his voice. Later that night, after Olivia had gone to bed, Emily sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Thomas sat beside her, his tie undone, leaning back with his eyes half closed. The sound of the city echoed faintly through the window, but neither of them seemed to notice. Emily glanced at him, biting her lip like she was trying to figure out how to say something. "Hey," she said, nudging his arm with her elbow. He blinked awake, glancing at her. "Yeah." Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her hoodie. She glanced at the TV, then back at him, her eyes a little more serious now. "You still think you missed everything?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Thomas blinked slowly, letting her words settle. Did he? Did he miss everything? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. He thought about all the things he'd missed: birthdays, first days of school, every scraped knee, every hard night when she needed someone and he wasn't there. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice quiet but honest. "I missed a lot." Emily looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her phone. She nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting that answer. "But," Thomas said, glancing at her with a small, tired smile, "I didn't miss this." Her eyes lifted, locking onto his. That hit differently. Her lips twitched like she wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, she leaned back into the couch, her face half hidden in the fabric of her hoodie. "Yeah," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I guess you didn't." Her eyes stayed on the TV, but her head leaned just a little toward him. "Not much. But enough. Enough for him to notice." Thomas leaned back too, his eyes closing slowly. His heart wasn't racing anymore. It didn't feel like he was chasing something. It didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. He was here. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Roots Renewal, lighting up every inch of the restaurant like it had been kissed by gold. The staff bustled in and out, prepping fresh vegetables, polishing glasses, and rolling silverware into napkins. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, warm and inviting. At the kitchen counter, Olivia called out orders, her voice sharp but calm, her hands moving with precision. Emily crouched near the window, camera raised, capturing the first customers of the day as they walked through the front door. She caught them at the perfect moment, their faces bright with surprise at how beautiful the restaurant was. Click. Her photo appeared on the screen. Perfect. She glanced toward the kitchen, where Thomas was leaning over the counter, laughing at something Olivia had said. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't wearing a suit or tie. He looked normal. Happy. Present. Her eyes lingered on him, just for a second, before she lifted the camera again. Her heart was steady. Her hands were steady. Focus. Light. Timing. Click. She didn't even need to check the screen this time. She knew it was good. Her eyes flickered toward Thomas. "You look decent in this one, old man," she called out, grinning. He raised an eyebrow, grinning back. "Decent, huh?" "Don't push it," she said, rolling her eyes. Her heart felt light. Like home.